Let me hear that music, please.
Everyone, let's thank Chris.
So play YMCA. Go ahead. Let's go. Nice and loud.
Here we go, everybody.
I keep hearing people compare Donald Trump to Kamala Harris as if Trump is some normal candidate. He's not. But that doesn't mean we should dismiss Trump completely either. After all, in 2020, over 74 million Americans voted for the guy. We also shouldn't think for a minute that the media is always fair to him. They aren't. Any type of fully dismissive approach to Donald Trump only adds rocket fuel to the mega fires that Elon Musk and his cronies are trying to stoke on a daily basis. So in this episode, we're going to try to give Donald Trump a fair shake. Take a very critical, objective assessment of the man, the presidential candidate, the former president. We're going to explore the good, the bad, the ugly. You decide whether to normalize it. When I've talked to Trump supporters or seen Trump supporters interviewed in different places, I often hear them dismiss the morality of the man, the persona of Donald Trump, and they say something along the lines of, I'm looking at his policies, or I like his policies. I think he's really good for America. This is a common normalization tactic of Donald Trump designed to excuse his criminal record, which, by the way, those 34 felonies, independent jury, independent judge, ordinary people concluded unanimously that Trump was guilty of falsifying business records in New York State. But they also excuse his civil record, his numerous bankruptcies, his multiple affairs. That's coming from some of the most morally righteous people in the country, by the way, Christians. Not to mention all of his other antics. Remember the Access Hollywood tape?
Moved on her, and I failed. I'll admit it.
Whoa.
I did try and fuck her. She was married.
Huge news there.
No, Nancy.
Yeah.
No, this was marriages. And I moved on her very heavily. In fact, I took her out furniture shopping. She wanted to get some furniture. I said, I'll show you where they have some nice furniture. I took her out furniture. I moved on her like a bitch. But I couldn't get there. And she was married. And all of a sudden, I see her. She's now got the big phony tits and everything. She's totally changed her look. I got to use some Tic Tacs just in case I start kissing her. You know, I'm automatically attracted to beautiful. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. You just kiss. I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
Whatever you want.
Grab them by the pussy.
Instead, you'll often see his supporters compliment his straight shooter approach, his unvarnished persona, how his policies are in the best interest not only of America, but of the world. They're designed to keep us safe, keep us out of war, lower the nuclear threat. I hear this nonstop from Trump supporters. But before we can even get into Donald Trump's policies and really take an objectively critical approach to assessing them, we first need to talk about the rule of law, because in a democracy, rule of law is the foundation for everything. Policies simply do not mean much. In fact, they mean little to nothing if the person who is president does not view himself as subject to the law as the common man. That's especially true now in the wake of the Supreme Court opinion from Trump v. United States, which gives presidents broad immunity from criminal prosecution so long as they are conducting official acts. But you could tell me, John, Trump just says a lot of things. His bombastic persona shouldn't always be taken seriously. You're taking Donald Trump too literally. You've undoubtedly heard this retort if you've spoken with enough Trump supporters. I would be very sympathetic toward it if January 6th hadn't have happened. I would be much more willing to believe that Donald Trump is engaging in bombastic puffery if he hadn't spent the last 4 years lying about election results in which he clearly lost. I would dismiss any statements that he would be dictator on day one. But we can't do that because January 6th happened and the past 4 years of election denial and lies have continued to persist. And for anyone still grasping for straws that election fraud of a material nature that could have changed the 2020 results actually happened, please take a look at the 60 some odd court cases that held that Trump had no case. Also, why did nobody challenge any down ballot results on those same ballots? If those ballots were so rife with fraud, Why weren't governors challenging the results? Senators, House members, state senators? It's more than just the president on those ballots. And if Republicans or Democrats were engaging in election fraud, you would think that they would go down the entire ballot, not just for president. How did Dominion Voting and others win huge defamation cases against Fox News? $787.5 million. And not to mention all the lawyers in Trump's circle that are completely out of the legal profession now. They've lost their law licenses, and people like Rudy Giuliani have lost a whole lot more. Truth is an affirmative defense in defamation cases, folks, which means that if you actually were telling the truth when talking about all those election lies, if you had evidence to substantiate your claims, you could have easily presented it in those defamation cases and won your case. You could have easily defended yourself because truth is an affirmative defense. But Fox News couldn't do that. Sidney Powell couldn't do that. Rudy Giuliani couldn't do that. And many of Trump's other lawyers were unsuccessful in defending themselves before bar association committees. But while all of those people around Trump in his orbit suffer the consequences of the 2020 election denialism, Donald Trump is running for president all over again. This is the same person who called the Georgia Secretary of State and told him down to the precise number of votes what that Georgia Secretary of State needed to find. 11,780 votes. The phone call's recorded, folks. There's no Trump derangement syndrome here or media bias. It's all recorded. You can listen to the recording yourself. It's linked in the episode description. He specifically asked for a very specific number of votes because he knew exactly what he needed in order to flip the state. That's why I've always argued that the Georgia indictment is by far the strongest against Donald Trump. There is direct evidence of him trying to interfere and overturn an election. I rehash all of this 2020 history not for fun, but because it's important. It paints the portrait of a man who is willing to defy truth, facts, and reality in order to cling to power. It reveals someone who is happy to disrupt or at least question the peaceful transfer of power that has persisted since America's founding. Also, he can stay president and not admit that he lost. So yes, I would be all for laughing at the silly statements that Donald Trump says. I think he's a fantastic comedian. I enjoyed watching The Apprentice for many years, but this is not someone who has the character and fitness required to be president. Had January 6th not happened, had 4+ years of election denialism not happened, I would probably be in a different position here today in objectively analyzing the man Donald Trump. But maybe you think everything that I just said was very partisan. So I challenge you with this exercise. Put Donald Trump's objective history, all of it, the business success, the business failures, so like the bankruptcies, the personal success, the personal failures, the governing successes, all of it. Put all the pros and cons of Donald Trump on a piece of paper, his resume or CV of sorts. Take away his name from the top of that paper so you don't know who you're talking about here when you're looking at it. And then ask yourself honestly, would you hire that person for a job where you work? Would you want that person to be part of your family as, say, the husband to your daughter or the husband of your friend? I find it very hard to believe that many of you would answer in the affirmative there, that you would be happy to hire that person or welcome that person into your personal life. Now that we have 2020 out of the way, I want to talk about an important rule of law consideration for 2024. I'm building up to the positive parts of Donald Trump's policies, but it's important that we talk about the foundation of the rule of law because, as I said, that runs through everything. This rule of law consideration is unique to 2024 because Trump hadn't attempted something like this during his first administration starting in 2016. And that consideration is how Donald Trump would govern the executive branch if elected president in November. We all know the efforts that Donald Trump has made to distance himself from Project 2025, and for good reason. It's massively unpopular with the majority of Americans. But there is one main area of Project 2025 that overlaps with Agenda 47. Agenda 47 is what Donald Trump calls his platform. And that area is how Donald Trump would handle the administrative state. For background, the administrative state is the generic terms for all of the administrative agencies that roll up to the executive branch, of which the president sits at the very top. That includes agencies that are not independent of the president. So think about agencies like the Department of Defense or the State Department. But there are also many administrative agencies that are independent of the president. The president has historically been unable to fire people within those agencies. Now imagine a president who doesn't like the independence of certain agencies. He wants to be able to fire and hire whomever he pleases. He may even want a say in the policy that an independent agency sets. Say, for example, the Federal Reserve's decision on whether to raise or lower interest rates. Even better, he wants to install party loyalists to run those administrative agencies that are historically independent so that he can set their policy direction from the get-go and have direct control over their activities. Donald Trump has promised to remove agency independence across the board in the executive branch if he is reelected. Anyone who thinks that the rule of law is essential for a thriving democracy should be concerned by this. It would allow Donald Trump to install yes men as the heads of these agencies and throughout the agencies themselves that are loyal to the party more so than they are to truth, reality, science, because if they come up with a policy decision that Trump doesn't like, they're at risk of losing their job even if it defies the truth or basic facts. A few examples. Take the Federal Election Commission. No longer would election laws govern or rule elections across the country. Donald Trump's views on election integrity would prevail. You've seen what happens with this in the state of Georgia, where a politicized state election board, which has historically just been very administrative and ceremonial, has now been politicized with mega representatives on the board that have mandated votes be counted now by hand due to their concerns, which are unfounded. They haven't been substantiated by credible evidence, that election fraud is so pervasive and could have a material impact on the Georgia elections. Another example is the Federal Reserve, which I mentioned. If Donald Trump doesn't like the interest rates, he could ask to raise or lower them himself, which no president in history has had a direct ability to do, and for good reason, because the president isn't also expected to be the chief officer for monetary policy in the country. The president is not supposed to be the chief economist, but under this new model for the executive branch where there are no independent agencies under Donald Trump, Trump's preferences on interest rates would rule. Now I get why Donald Trump would want to remove some agency independence. He's been burned by agencies in the past. There were plenty of leaks throughout his first administration, and he thinks that there are career bureaucrats in many of these agencies that are simply out to get him. As a personal anecdote though, in my prior life as a compliance officer who liaised occasionally with different government agencies from the EPA to financial regulators, never once did I get the sense that they were politically motivated or motivated in any other way other than just wanting to do their professional job well. We may have thought that certain requests were unreasonable at times, but they always seemed to be operating in good faith, and they were respected as experts. But for all of Donald Trump's deep state fear-mongering, we didn't see any real efforts to sabotage his administration's governance during his first term. The IRS, for example, when he lowered taxes on corporations, there weren't IRS agents going rogue and refusing to execute the policies that he had set. People were doing their jobs as they were asked to do them. What we will see, though, in a second Trump administration, where there's absolutely no or little agency independence, is a subversion of truth, facts, and justice in some of America's most sensitive administrative agencies. They would all be subject and beholden to a new law and standard: Donald Trump. Why would any business person want this type of uncertainty? A Donald Trump that has no independence from an agency like the Federal Trade Commission could just choose to fire Lina Khan, the current head of the FTC, or any other FTC commissioner that he just simply doesn't like, replace them with a mega loyalist, and then seek to go out and punish the business executive or company that he doesn't like. Basically, any company would have to curry favor with him or bow to his authority in order to be on good terms. That is not a situation that American commerce or any American business executive should want to be in. And it's certainly not attractive for foreign companies to do business in the United States. For those who think the Supreme Court will check his behavior, all one has to do is read any of the cases that pertain to presidential power or Donald Trump specifically at the end of their most recent term, and you'll see that they went to great lengths to try to protect Donald Trump, doing some serious constitutional law, legal gymnastics to justify things like presidential immunity outside of official acts. At this point, it's reasonable to expect that the current makeup of the conservative majority on the Supreme Court will defend Trump at all costs. I did promise you a very objective take, though, in this video, and Trump did do some good. Well, when he was president, and even in the years following his presidency, despite all of the lies. So it's time to deliver on some of those positives. But I cannot stress enough that you would need some very compelling arguments to counter all of the rule of law considerations that I just gave that heavily weigh against Donald Trump and the possibilities of a second Trump presidency. But assuming that you have good answers for his threats to the rule of law, his character and fitness, his age, which is going to be pretty advanced if he serves out a full term. He would be 82, which many people who criticize Biden for his advanced age, Biden admittedly showed it much more, but we don't know what an 82-year-old Donald Trump is going to be like. We can now turn to his policies once we've gotten all of the foundational issues out of the way. But competency and the moral makeup of a person should always predominate, especially if we're talking about a president of the United States. But when it does come to Donald Trump's policies, he did some good. I'll be the first to admit that his overall approach to China was long overdue. There were many presidents and presidential candidates, guys like Mitt Romney come to mind, who complained about China manipulating its currency, manipulating its free trade agreements with other countries around the world. But none of these people really ever did anything to China. They never really put China in its place, called them for their unfair practices, and implemented policies to frankly punish China and deter them from acting unfairly in international markets until Donald Trump. And while I didn't always agree with imposing tariffs, starting trade wars, what he did to just shift the American psyche toward treating China as what they truly were and continue to be, an adversary, not a ally in international trade and geopolitics. Trump deserves a lot of credit for that, for just changing the whole mindset shift to China. Would I want different policies toward dealing with some of these trade imbalances and currency manipulation and other economic factors? Yes. I think tariffs are quite extreme and damaging, especially in terms of inflation. But Trump's change of mindset toward China deserves a lot of credit. The number two positive thing that I would commend Trump on is his stance on NATO in terms of every NATO member paying its fair share. I have many disagreements with Donald Trump in foreign policy, especially as it relates to countries like Ukraine, who I believe he would just deliver on a silver platter to Vladimir Putin based on many of his past comments. I also don't like the idea of him totally abandoning NATO ever. I think that would be terribly detrimental to the most successful defense alliance in the history of humanity. But he was absolutely right to demand more accountability and participation from NATO members, because the United States for far too long had been footing the the entire bill and participating disproportionate to many other NATO members. The third thing I would commend Trump on are the Abraham Accords. I thought those were a good effort to try to normalize relations between Israel and many Arab nations. Trump didn't get enough credit for the Abraham Accords, but they were probably the closest America has ever come to helping Israel reach normalized trade relations and just diplomatic relations with the Arab world. To Trump's credit, he started no new foreign wars. His economy thrived until COVID. Inflation was low, the stock market was up, and unemployment was down. So there was a lot to like, and I can understand why some people commend Trump for some of his policies. But if you simply say, I'm looking at his policies, or I think he'll keep us safe, that's taking an unreasonably narrow and limited view of the man. So let's talk about the bad policies of Donald Trump now. Staying on the economic theme, Donald Trump was anything but fiscally conservative. I can't stand it when I hear these fiscal conservative thinkers or advocates, whether they're in government or whether they're businessmen, who think that Donald Trump is somehow a fiscal conservative because his record shows that he's anything but. He spent like the archetype of a government-loving liberal, the same people that many Republicans love to criticize. Even before the pandemic struck, Trump spent wildly. He racked up a significant amount of debt, as he had done in his business life, by the way. And ultimately, when all was said and done, he added more to the federal debt than any president in history. Some $7.8 trillion. How is that fiscally conservative? And speaking of the pandemic, Donald Trump's management of that was horrific. The US was near the top in terms of death rate of any developed country. Trump recommended that Americans try things like bleach. And don't say that that was misinformation. I watched the whole press conference in which he recommended that, and how you could zap COVID away with some UV rays or something. He also promised that COVID-19 would be miraculously gone by April or Easter. The fact is that he didn't take the threat of COVID-19 seriously until it was too late. I gave him credit for keeping the United States out of foreign wars, new ones that is, but his agreements that he struck with the Taliban arguably set up the Biden administration for what was by far the worst foreign policy disaster of Biden's presidency. Yes, Biden ultimately made the call to evacuate Afghanistan when he did, and he should bear the brunt of the blame for that mishap and catastrophic foreign policy failure. But with that said, Trump left him in a horrible situation, striking a deal with the Taliban that legitimized them, leaving them in their strongest military position in Afghanistan since 2001. That's what the Biden administration inherited. And before we move on from Trump's foreign policy, how could we forget some of his encounters with Vladimir Putin, Russia's president? His performance at the infamous Helsinki summit was absolutely disastrous. It was embarrassing how he threw the entire US intelligence community under Putin's bus. Trump praised Putin while questioning his own intelligence agency. And by the way, the CIA is another one of the many independent agencies that have historically been separate from the president, and for good reason. Trump could significantly politicize agencies like the CIA in a second administration. This pandering to autocrats and dictators was basically a daily occurrence for Donald Trump. He was sending off love letters to Kim Jong-un. He was complimenting Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil. He's best buddies with Viktor Orban. Trump celebrated strongmen like no president has ever done in US history. And surprisingly, none of these critiques that I've given have even touched upon Trump's most challenging issue, at least politically, and that's abortion. He has flip-flopped and changed his perspective on this one policy issue so many times. So when anyone ever tells you that we should just trust that he wouldn't sign a national abortion ban, just point to the time when he was extremely pro-life when it was politically convenient, or when he was extremely pro-choice when that was also politically convenient. The vast majority of Americans want, at a minimum, the protections that Roe v. Wade gave them. So this is just a losing issue for Trump, who worked so hard to install 3 Supreme Court justices that would overturn Roe v. Wade. The same is true with guns. The vast majority of Americans want minimum and uniform standards across the country at a federal level on gun control. Nobody wants to take your guns, guys. Trump expects a lot of sympathy from all these crazy people that try to shoot him, but he never asked the question, how do these mentally unstable people get guns in the first place? Ask the parents of the many school children who have lost their lives for the last few decades about sympathy. Trump may think that his best issue is border control, and I would have agreed with him had he not actually tried to sabotage the border deal and been very explicit as to why he sabotaged it in order to hammer Democrats on the border throughout this election cycle. That border deal was bipartisan and was led by one of the most conservative senators that we have in James Lankford. It would have fixed many of the asylum and other immigration issues, but Trump blew up the deal so he could campaign on the issue. Let's talk about now why all of these critiques of Donald Trump far outweigh any of the good that he did. Reasonable minds can differ on policy. I really miss a world where we can have constructive dialogue and debates on policy issues that we approach with good faith, where we're both trying to just find what's the best baseline, what's the truth, what is best for the country. We can have reasonable debates and people can have different views and opinions on policy issues, but one thing that we shouldn't disagree on, at least in America, are the fundamental principles of American democracy. If a candidate has demonstrated a consistent disrespect for the rule of law, that should be an immediate disqualification for the office of the president. And that doesn't matter what political party they belong to. That should be disqualifying immediately. Because the rule of law, as I mentioned at the top of this episode, is the foundation for everything. Combine that with a host of concerning policy statements and actions, and it's nearly impossible to find enough positivity from a candidate of that nature to warrant support. Unless, of course, your affection for the person far outweighs all of those other factors. But if you're willing to excuse the rule of law, the number of bad policies that that person has executed, their moral character and criminal record, how they left America with the most debt in its history, you still have to be comfortable with the endless grift. Trump recently launched an official Trump coin. He's previously sold Trump Bibles, Trump sneakers, and a Trump NFT. I'm not saying other politicians haven't used public office to profit privately, but we've never seen something of the scale of Donald Trump. His endless willingness to profit from a position of public trust is yet another example of his questionable character and fitness. Republicans were running around these past 4 years investigating Hunter Biden and his ties to China and Ukraine, but nobody once thought to question Jared Kushner and the billions of dollars he accepted from the Saudi royal family, despite having zero prior investment experience. And that's just months after leaving the Trump White House, where he was a senior advisor leading American efforts at formulating policy in the Middle East. Trump also charged exorbitant rates for his Secret Service detail at his own hotels. And he also accepted inflated prices from foreign dignitaries who stayed at the Trump Hotel in DC. Nobody from the Republican Party ever batted an eye. So with so much to criticize when it comes to Donald Trump, it's easy to think that the mainstream media is just always out to get him, that they're going to be unfairly critical because they just don't pick their battles well. The countless legal actions against him can certainly appear like lawfare, which is basically the weaponization of the legal system against Donald Trump. But while I will be the first to admit that he did some good while he was in office and that the media is very unfair to Donald Trump at times, we also have to ask ourselves, why is Donald Trump really running for a second term, for a second crack at being president? What is truly motivating him to be president? Is it really for a love of country, that America won't be great without him? Or is it actually immunity from prosecution? Is it to save himself from likely criminal convictions and a prison sentence? When you understand Donald Trump's motives, you can get a better sense of Donald Trump's behavior. For any of the good that Donald Trump did during his first administration, it's far outweighed by all of the bad and what his plans are for the future. And if we realize that future, or Donald Trump is president again. It will test the limits of American democracy. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to leave comments, and I'll see you on the next one. Think critically.